Welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. Today I'm going to talk about my favorite albums, the greatest albums, I think, of 1985. 1985 was a pretty big year for me. I turned 18 in 1985 and graduated high school in 1985 and went away to college in 1985, leaving everybody I knew for an entirely new place in a new city in a new part of the country even. So, as I look at the list of albums that I have and or listened to that were released in 1985, some of those albums are a bit hard to listen to nowadays. My criteria for making the top 10 were that I liked them back then, not necessarily having bought them in 1985, but if not in 1985, probably in 1986. So I liked them back then, and I still like them now. And moreover, I can still listen to them now without too much cringing, and preferably without any cringing. Now, a couple of these albums are, among my favorites of all time. I'd say the top three are some of my favorite albums of all time. At the end, I'll talk about some albums that didn't make the list and why. Because some of them that didn't make the list, I listened to quite a bit back then. Well, enough of that. Let's start with number 10. Translate Slowly by Zeitgeist, who subsequently became known as the Reavers. This was an Austin band, jangly pop. And I bought this album in 1985. In fact, probably either in spring or summer of 1985. I don't know exactly when it came out, but I know that I had it and I listened to it at least in the summer of 1985, and I took it to college with me in 1985, and at least one of my roommates still likes the album. It's a bit hard for me to listen to. I wasn't sure I should put it on the top 10 because I associate it with, that final bittersweet summer in Arkansas and that rather frightening dark fall and early winter in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But I put it on the turntable, and it is the vinyl that's sitting on the turntable right now. And I listened to the first side, found myself singing along to pretty much every song. So this still holds up. Let's move it along to number 9. Visions of Excess by the Golden Palominos. I thought this was a fake band back in the day, but I guess they weren't actually a fake band. They just had a couple of very well-known guest singers on this album, including Michael Stipe of REM, and John Lydon of Public Image Limited, and before that he was Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, of course. As with the Zeitgeist album, as with my number 10, this isn't an album that I've listened to a lot in the subsequent years. But I did put it on relatively recently and got a good kick out of it. And, that's still a really good album. So here it is at number 9. Number 8. And here's where it starts to get difficult. I'd say numbers 8 through 5 are pretty tough to distinguish. So at number 8, I have New Day Rising by Husker Du. Came out in 1985. I bought it in 1985, and in fact, I bought it, I think, in the summer of 1985. My buddy Eric turned me on to it. Eric turned me on to a lot of stuff back in the day. I think he's the one who told me about Zeitgeist, and of course, he told me about Husker Du. I think this is my favorite album by Husker Du. I don't listen to this album a lot anymore, but when I've put it on again, I like it a lot. 1985, I was still listening to King Crimson, Talking Heads, but I was sort of transitioning into the alternative scene, some of which was kind of punk rock, and Husker Du was kind of punk rock, kind of thrash. And so this was one of the first bands that had that kind of punk rock spirit that I listened to a lot. Not the first punk rock band that I ever listened to or by any means, but this was one of my favorite albums. If you don't know about Husker Du, geez, where have you been? I mean, Minneapolis band, or at least, you know, Twin Cities area band in the 80s. I think I only saw them twice. I saw them once in Boston. I didn't like the Boston show all that much because it seemed like they only played the songs off the new album, which I wasn't thrilled with at the time. You know, after this came another really good album, Flip Your Wig, and then an album that some people thought was a little bit of a sellout, Candy Apple Gray. I kind of lose track of the names of the albums after Candy Apple Gray. Of course, they had some stuff before this, just not stuff that I was as into as this. Zen Arcade was a double album that came out before this, and that's a good album too. But this one came out when I was 18, and I bought it when I was 18. So there we go. At number 7, Real Nighttime by Game Theory. Game Theory is still one of my favorite bands of all time. This is not their best album and not my favorite album of theirs, but it's a really good album. It's a little cringy, but you know what? Game Theory is all kind of cringy. Okay, who's Game Theory? They were a band from I guess Davis, California, or Sacramento. I think Davis though. I think that, you know, sort of part of the UC Davis scene. Lead singer, guitar player Scott Miller, amazing songwriter, not an amazing vocalist, but I don't think I'd want to listen to a Game Theory song sung by somebody else. Scott Miller took his own life in the 2000s. Amazing band. I never did get to see them. Real jangly. Well, not super jangly. No, I mean, just really good pop songs. But because Scott Miller had arguably a little trouble carrying a tune, he put as his vocal credit on, I think, the album after this, the Big Shot Chronicles, Miserable Wine. So, you know, he totally had self-knowledge as to how good a singer he was, but he was a singer-songwriter and he wrote amazing songs. And the production on these albums was really, really good. Maybe Real Nighttime, maybe not the best production, although I'd say Real Nighttime sort of starts a series of their albums that had really excellent production. Big Shot Chronicles after this had amazing production, and Lolita Nation after that also had really great production. And that would have been the last album I would have bought of theirs, back in the day anyway. But definitely one of my favorite bands of all time, one of my favorite times in the 80s. But I didn't start listening to Game Theory until the first album I bought by Game Theory was Big Shot Chronicles, which came after this. And so this was sort of a dig into more Game Theory purchase. So I didn't listen to it in 1985, if you're wondering. Okay, here's one I did listen to in 1985, but only bought recently. This is number 6, The Head on the Door by The Cure. I did listen to this in 1985 because my roommate Jeff had this album and played it. And, you know, I didn't like all of Jeff's albums. I'm sure Jeff didn't like all of my albums. But this was among the ones that I really liked. And it took me a while to admit to how much I liked The Cure. So I only bought this really recently. This is, I think, the only one of this top 10 that is in my heavy rotation that's up here past the turntable that you can't see, because I bought it relatively recently. I don't know a huge amount about The Cure, but you know, they're a pretty famous band. I don't need to tell you about them. One of their great albums from the mid 80s. All right. Number 5. Fables of the Reconstruction by REM. I bought this within days of it being released. I think that was the first time, at least that I know of, that I had bought an album so close to its release date. Oh shit, REM's new album is coming out. Yeah, I was a senior in high school. I can't remember whether it was winter or spring of 85 when this came out. Was it even summer? I don't know. That whole time sort of merges together musically for me. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows about REM. I think of REM as sort of the new Southern rock, along with the B-52s, out of Athens, Georgia, presenting a sound that was decidedly Southern. But they weren't, of course, thought of as Southern rock. And I guess according to the definition of Southern rock, they don't meet it. But I can't think of many bands that are more quintessentially Southern than REM. And some of these other bands like Zeitgeist, aka the Reavers, very Southern band. Can you tell I grew up in the South? Maybe not. All right. So that's number 5. So we are in the top 5 here. And now it starts to get really difficult, but not as difficult. The top 3 is the most difficult, but here is number 4, About Her Steps by the Silos. Amazing band. I saw them in Cambridge, Mass. Had a cringy conversation with the guitarist. Where I was really excited to meet him and just was sort of stupid and goofy and cringy. But from New York. And that surprised me and has to do with how cringy my conversation was with the guitarist. Because I was just sort of like, you're from New York? Oh my God. Because it's like folk rock, country rock kind of stuff. Excellent songwriting. This album and the next one called Cuba were, among my favorite albums at the time. And I think I either bought this in 85 or 86. I'm not sure, but I think I did buy it in 85. I had seen it in 85. I tried to get onto the Harvard radio station and quit partway through the competition to get onto the radio station. Partly because it was a competition and I had enough to deal with being a friggin' freshman from Arkansas at Harvard, taking accelerated friggin' chemistry and second semester calculus at the same time. And yeah, it was just not the headspace I needed to be competing to be a college radio DJ. Anyway, but I saw this album and remember, I don't think I listened to it at the time, but I remember reading what people do at college radio stations. I don't know, maybe it's a general thing. They put stickers on them and write comments about the album, sort of mini reviews of the album. And I remember specifically the one about this album saying, "This ain't no Eagles reunion," talking about how good it was. And it is excellent. All right. Now we go to the top 3. And these are, About Her Steps is a great album, but I don't still listen to it all that much. These last 3 I have been listening to pretty steadily ever since I bought them. So, number 3, Exploring the Axis by Thin White Rope. Psychedelic cowpunk? Yeah, sure. In the summer after my freshman year, oh geez, it wasn't until towards the end of the summer that I went home to Arkansas, because I spent the beginning of the summer with my roommate in New Jersey. I spent the middle of the summer in China with my parents, and then came home with them to Arkansas. Had no music. All my albums were up in Cambridge, and my friend Eric loaned me a few records. Among them were Psycho Candy by the Jesus and Mary Chain and this one. I considered Psycho Candy for this list, but it was never an album, either that I ran across and bought or felt super inclined to buy, at least not at the time. This one, however, I went and bought as soon as I could. The first song just grabbed me right out of the gate. It's a song called Disney Girl. Has some great songs on it. Dead Grandmas on a Train is just a friggin' classic. Oh my God. Amazing album. I can't remember how many records they made. I have their first three. Moonhead was the second one, and In a Spanish Cave was the third. Moonhead, another favorite album of mine. In a Spanish Cave, not so much. Doesn't, it's not a bad album. It just never did really grab me like the first two did. Number two, shouldn't be a surprise to anybody who really knows me, but might be a surprise to some people who think they know me. Because this is hardcore. Uh, so number two, The Fun Just Never Ends by Government Issue. I saw Government Issue at least twice. I saw them once in Cambridge, one of the scariest shows I ever went to. Okay, so I'm standing there. I probably had kind of long hair at the time. I don't remember for sure. I'm standing there. It's this pretty small club, really small club, actually. TT the Bears. In the back of my head, what the fuck? I turn around and there's this fucking giant skinhead. And he's all tricked out, right? He's folded, he's got his arms folded like this. He's totally bald. And he's looking at me going, like totally cut. No shirt on, suspenders, combat boots, totally ripped. Just like, what the fuck? And then there's this mosh pit, which was extremely violent. And I had no inclination of getting into that mosh pit, except that I did want to move to Government Issue. I saw them again at the Rat in Boston. I can't remember whether I got this in 85. Of course, it came out in 85. I may not have bought it till 86. Their songs are so fast that this is really kind of the length of an EP, but it does have an album number of songs on it. The first two songs in particular are some of my favorite of all time, Fun and Games and Written Word. Written Word especially is just a friggin' amazing song. It's hardcore. If you don't have any inclination to listen to hardcore punk rock, then don't even go there. But they had an amazing sound. I mean, Tom Lyle could really friggin' play guitar, and he had a really neat sound. It sounded like the bass was turned way up, or maybe he was going like all neck pickup or something like that. Really gutty, of course, pretty distorted hardcore guitar sound. But they're one of those hardcore bands that sort of evolved past hardcore. And this is sort of catches them right at that transition between full-on hardcore and their next album, which was the self-titled Government Issue, which was prog. It was prog. And then the albums after that, they were trying to see, I mean, they were that one of those bands on the edge of like breaking into semi-mainstream. Some bands that had been considered unplayable on the radio were starting to get airplay, and maybe Government Issue could break through. And they came out with a couple of albums, You and I forget what the last one was called. Maybe there was one more, I can't remember. They're just not as good. I mean, they're not bad, but they're just not so special as this. The one before this is also one of my favorite albums, Joyride. Just really catches them at that cusp of still hardcore, not pop, but have evolved their sound, honed their sound to a fine edge, evolved their sound. It still has a complexity to it, despite, being kind of simple. I mean, whatever. It's a great album. I love it. Number one, album of 1985. And this is sort of a close call. Well, all these top three are close calls. But I'd say especially these last two are close calls. Okay, number one, Mars Needs Guitars by the Hoodoo Gurus. This is the Hoodoo Gurus' best album. The one before this was really good. Stone Age Romeo's, really good album. This is better. The hooks on this album are friggin' amazing. After this, it went quickly downhill. Really kind of heartbreakingly. I mean, I think generally Hoodoo Gurus fans would acknowledge this. I saw so back in the days of Zoom faculty meetings and so on, had a Zoom meeting with one of my colleagues, Adam, and he sees the Rickenbacker in the background, and he's like, "Ah, well, you got a Rick," and at some point he shared a couple of pictures, maybe two pictures of his guitars, and they were these two guitars, and I recognized them right away. I was like, "Wait a minute, Adam, you have the guitars that are on the cover of Mars Needs Guitars." He's like, yeah, I was a pretty big Hoodoo Gurus fan. And he agreed after this album. Well, Adam's Australian, and they're an Australian band. And he agreed after this album, they went pretty downhill pretty fast. And it's hard to say what exactly became not awesome about them because this has such good pop songs on it, but they have a humorous side, but still an edge. And it's hard to say what changed between their first two albums, Stone Age Romeo's and this one, and the later stuff, which just kind of lost that edge. Well, I'll leave it up there while I do a few honorable mentions, or at least mentions. I don't know if these are actually honorable mentions. I wanted to mention a few bands or a few albums that could have made this list, but for Little Creatures by Talking Heads. God, I was so into that album in '85, but I played it out. I can't listen. I couldn't listen to that album anymore after a couple of years. You know, part of that was me getting more into seriously alternative and punk rock music, and Talking Heads just seemed a bit, especially Little Creatures was just awfully. I mean, it was a great album, but it didn't have the edge of earlier Talking Heads. I sold it. I don't have that album anymore. I think. I'm pretty sure I did. I mean, I still have the one before it. I still have Speaking in Tongues and all the other ones before that. I still have Stop Making Sense. But yeah, Little Creatures, I just can't listen to it anymore. I couldn't. Suzanne Vega, her self-titled album. I saw Suzanne Vega in a sort of mini concert that she played in the alley behind the Harvard Coop. And, you know, it was an album signing thing. And, you know, I remember having to talk my album through the line because I hadn't, you know, it was one of these deals, you know, you buy the album, have her sign it. And I'd brought my own. And so I was like, no, this one's mine. I'm not paying for it. And I took a friend at the time to see her as well. And he just really thought she was amazing as well. But, you know, you know, she sings sad songs, let's just say. That year was partly pretty sad for me. Yeah, the associations are just, I couldn't listen to it after a while. Wow. Tim by The Replacements. You know, I listened to that album a lot in '85 and the one before it, Let It Be, but they're kind of cringy to me now. And it's hard for me to listen to them. The Replacements, their songs are pretty emotional. You know, they don't hold anything back. And I got to hand it to them for that. But it's also kind of, you know, ooh, after a while. And and after a while, I stopped really being able. I stopped listening to those albums. I remember putting one of either Tim or Let It Be on relatively recently, and just kind of cringing my way through it. Ain't Love Grand by X. I saw that tour. I saw X play at the Orpheum in Boston. That concert ruined my hearing for at least a year. They were so effing loud. It was really cool to see Billy Zoom play the guitar. I mean, he really does just stand there, like legs spread, smiling, with his rockabilly, blonde hairdo. Oh my God, that was loud. I would have put the Lost EP by the Chills on here, but it's just an EP. Talk About the Weather by Red Lorry, Yellow Lorry. I haven't seen that album since I graduated from college, and I thought I might have it on tape, and I was looking through my tapes earlier to see if I could find it and put it on to see if it held up. That was an album that my roommate Jeff bought and that I liked, but hadn't ever picked up. I have fond memories of that album, but I haven't listened to it in a long, long time. Crush by Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. My roommate John, OJ, R.I.P. convinced me to buy that album. John was amazing. I sort of loved, hated that album for years and years, and I listened to it again recently. I was like, you know what, this is pretty damn good. There are some albums that were released in '85 that were just not the best albums by those bands. Bad Moon Rising by Sonic Youth. Kind of unlistenable. I became a pretty big Sonic Youth fan. I saw them at least once. Goo was like the last new album I bought on vinyl before it just became such a pain in the butt to buy albums on vinyl that I finally broke down and bought a CD player. But Bad Moon Rising, kind of unlistenable. I remember I was playing it, summer after my sophomore year of college. I had an apartment with a couple of friends, and I was playing this album in my room, and one of my roommates comes in and he goes, "This sucks." Yeah, it does. It sucks. Album after that, Sister, I love that album, but Bad Moon Rising, oof. And another one that deserves mention, I think, is Squirrel Bait by Squirrel Bait. I think it was their first album, and it just doesn't quite have it. It just doesn't quite fire on all cylinders. The one after it, oh my God, it just combines, like full on thrash with amazing hooks. Great album. Their next album, Skag Heaven. Great album, but Squirrel Bait, not so much. First one. Soul to Soul by Stevie Ray Vaughan and Double Trouble. Just not his best work. First album, friggin' amazing. Second album, wow. And I think he just kind of got into drink and I don't know. I mean, I have it. I didn't get really into Stevie Ray Vaughan until a few years ago. Although I do remember Stevie Ray Vaughan very clearly at the time. I remember in particular Stevie Ray Vaughan as, well, after Stevie Ray Vaughan, people stopped talking about there wouldn't be another guitarist as great as Jimi Hendrix ever again, because Stevie Ray was so good. Soul to Soul, just not necessarily the best album, but you know what? It's also, I've kind of bought several Stevie Ray Vaughan CDs in quick succession and just haven't really gotten into that one as much as some of the others. One that is really worth mentioning, and I only bought it recently, but I remember it at the time because a friend of mine across the hall freshman year had it, was Showdown by Albert Collins, Robert Cray, and Johnny Copeland. Three blues guitarists and singers. Pretty amazing album. I'm not that into the blues, so Stevie Ray Vaughan and like Robert Cray are sort of as far into like serious electric blues as I get. So it's an amazing album. It just, hasn't been a favorite, and I've only actually picked it up relatively recently. Freaky Styley by Red Hot Chili Peppers. I wasn't into them in '85, but I did see them probably on the tour for Uplift Mofo Party Plan. The sheer animosity that they felt towards that Boston crowd was amazing. I've rarely been to a show. I've been to a few shows where there was a bad band audience dynamic, but in this case it was all one way. It was all like, okay, let's remember, this is the '80s. This is the days of intense rivalry between the Celtics and the Lakers, and Red Hots were serious Lakers fans. They could not abide by Celtics fans. Or Flea at some point just going off and like, I don't know, Boston facts. And right as he does that, you hear from the back of the crowd, I wanna party on your poop, babe. And it just totally broke the tension. It was like several, like a whole crew of people in the back of the crowd start singing that song. And after that, it was okay. Red Hot's sort of, eh. Well, Freaky Styley came out in '85. I was kind of into that album, but it's not great. It's not great. I mean, it's okay. It's not great. Descendants had an album, Up on the Sun by Meat Puppets. I kind of thought I was really supposed to like the Meat Puppets a lot, and I don't know, they're just not that great, or at least I just don't like them that much. I've got a couple of their albums. They're all right. I think that'll probably do it. So that's my top 10 for 1985, 40th anniversary. Hope you enjoyed the video. I think that should wrap it up, don't you? Hope you enjoyed the video. Have a great one, and I'll talk to you later.